Now, when we begin to think about ethical issues and particularly move to specific ethical issues, it's helpful for us to think through the Ten Commandments and how the Ten Commandments should shape the way we think about all of these issues. The reason is that the Ten Commandments are shaped in such a way that the first four commandments help us to know how to have our right faith ordered to God, whereas the next six help us to shape the way we're to love one another and live in society together. Now, before we jump into this particular commandment, the sixth commandment, it's helpful for us to have an understanding how Christians have historically viewed the Ten Commandments and how they ought to shape us in our understanding of morality and ethics. Particularly, it's helpful for us to understand that in history of the church, the Ten Commandments have been understood to have both a broad and a narrow meaning. Now, when we talk about the narrow meaning of the Scriptures, you take, for example, the seventh commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. Narrowly, we would mean that that commandment is prohibiting us from sleeping with someone besides our spouse. But because the Scripture and the commandment arises from the very nature and character of God, who's pure and who's holy and who created sex, that commandment is actually also giving us a broad understanding that we should protect all areas of sexuality. And so when we think about the broad areas, it's from that we can get larger principles by which we can then move into all areas that relate to sexuality, for example, with the seventh commandment. Now, in light of this, when we turn to the sixth commandment, and the Scripture says, thou shalt not murder, this speaks directly to the issue of when you've taken a life justly or unjustly, but it also speaks to all areas that have to do with the protection and the sanctity or the sacredness of human life. And so in order for us to dig in a little bit here, let's take a moment to look at the Hebrew word that's translated in the commandment, thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not murder. Now, the word that's sometimes translated killing or murder is the word ratzak. And ethicist John Frame, in his book, The Doctrine of Christian Life, gives us a helpful way to understand what this word ratzak means. He says this, most often, ratzak refers to the killing that is unlawful or forbidden. It's not used for killing animals or for killing in war. And that should suggest to us that the best translation here is murder and not the more general word kill. However, the term differs from our English word murder in that it also applies to manslaughter or negligent homicide. And Frame goes on to help us understand that what he means by negligent homicide is the failure to take adequate precautions in how we guard human life. So the commandment does not prohibit all killing, rather it prohibits the unjust killing of human life. So what is so special about human life? Well, God has placed a unique value on human life, and we see this, first of all, in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, when we see that human beings are made uniquely in the image of God. And indeed, in Psalm 139, verses 14 and 15, the Scriptures tell us that human beings have been fearfully and wonderfully made. And so when we think of human life, we then put in the categories of the sanctity of human life. And the word sanctity means that it's set apart for a special means, that God has given an ultimate importance, or if you will, a higher importance to human life because of the special job that He has humans to do in the world. They've been set aside or made sanctified for a specific thing. Another word that we commonly attach to human life is the word sacredness of that. And what we mean here is that human beings are meant to be a picture of something about God Himself. So when we're made in the image of God, we're meant to be dedicated to God's service, and we're supposed to picture forth, in that sense, almost like a living sacrament in the world is the human life on that. Now, all of these ideas flow from the reality that God has created human beings in His image for special reasons that He's set us aside for. So when we consider then what it means to take a human life, or whether or not we should protect human life, this then leads us to the discussion of abortion as we think about life at the beginning of life. Now, in the United States, abortion became legal in 1973, and it immediately became what we describe as a watershed issue. So what do we mean by a watershed issue? Well, in geography or geology, what this means is that when water in a rainstorm falls on mountains, it'll fall on one side or the other, and then all the water will flow in a particular direction. So morally then, when we use this language of a moral watershed, what this means is when an issue is decided upon, it will then have influence on all other like and related issues on that. And Roe v. Wade was certainly a watershed issue in the United States in how we think about human life and when it's okay to take human life or not take human life. Since 1973 in the United States, when Roe v. Wade was passed, immediately we went from having 0 legal abortions to over 1.6 million abortions a year. That's over 61 million babies where their lives have been taken or terminated since the passing of Roe v. Wade. And you compare this roughly to the 6 million lives that were lost in the Holocaust in World War II with the Jews, and you begin to get a scale for how much abortion is taking place in the United States. Worldwide, since 1980, there's been over 1.5 billion abortions. Stop and pause on that number. 1/6 of the world's population has been destroyed through abortion. So what are the moral arguments that are related to the topic of abortion, and how should we think about this? You know, it was the case early on in the debate in the 1970s that people were making the argument that the baby was just fetal tissue within a woman's body and that baby wasn't alive. But that's no longer the case. That argument has been gone for a long time simply because science and medicine has proven that that's not to be the case. For example, let me give you some of the simple and clear scientific facts. When a baby is conceived, from the moment of conception, there is a full genetic code that is unique to the child from the moment of conception. The nervous system begins to be developed at day 20. The brain is fully proportioned by day 30. There's spontaneous movements of the baby by day 45. The lips reacts to touch by 7 weeks. Eyelids and palms of hands react to touch by 8.5 weeks. At 11 weeks, the baby can respond to touch, to light, to heat, and to noise, and will recoil if pricked by a needle, and can even learn to recoil if that baby hears a beep and then is pricked again. Now, I don't know who does those experiments, but what this does is it shows us that here in the womb, that this is not just merely tissue, that there's something that's alive there. There's a human life that's taking place. The second trimester doesn't even begin to week 13, and many women might not even know they're pregnant while all these things are taking place. So scientifically, we would say that this is clearly a human being. The human fetus, the conception, is clearly human. It's clearly alive. The DNA is not a dog or a cat or a tree. It's a human being that's growing inside of there. It's actual. The baby's actually there. It's not just potentially there. And the baby's undeniably distinct from the mother with its own gene code and often its own blood type. So then the question would be, if science has shown that there's a human being that's involved there, then how would we try to justify the taking of a human life that's in a mother's womb? Well, in the United States, then, we've done this largely by 2 different arguments that are being put forth to try to justify abortion on demand. The first one is attempting to separate the categories of a human being from a human person. So the question would be, okay, we have to grant scientifically and medically that there's a human being in the womb, but does that mean that the human being has all the rights and privileges of a full-grown adult? This argument is trying to separate these 2 categories by saying that even if someone has a human gene code, even if it's clearly a human being, someone has to develop or show the functionality of certain characteristics that would say this person is actually a person, not just a being. Some of those categories that are represented there would be someone would need to be conscious of themselves. Someone would need to have the ability to interact, to feel pain, to be able to reason, to be able to communicate with others. And so the idea being that the baby may be a human being from the moment of conception, but somewhere along the line of time, they actually would need to show and demonstrate that they rise to the level of personhood. Now, this might happen at 6 months old, it might happen at 2 months old, it might happen at 2 years old, depending on the abilities of the child. And so this raises the troubling question and even introduces the idea of infanticide. For if a person doesn't demonstrate the categories of personhood, then perhaps it's okay to take the life of a human being even after they're born, or as we'll talk about in a future discussion, or at the end of life. So this is a problematic idea, this idea of personhood being separated from human being. The second form of argument is the one of radical autonomy. And this would be the idea that human beings have complete ownership over themselves. And so therefore, a woman who's pregnant has complete rights over her own body to do whatever she wants to do with her own body. And this would say, in regard to the argument of abortion, that if she doesn't want to carry a child, she shouldn't be forced to carry a child, even if we were to make the argument that the child is a full human person. So how should we think about these then from the point of view of the Bible? Well, in regard to the personhood argument, there's never a time in the Bible where you see the distinction being made between a human person and a human being. In fact, many places in the scriptures will indicate that God thinks the same of the child in the womb as he does of the full-grown adult person outside of the womb. You see this in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5. In Isaiah 49:1, you see God's knowledge of the person before they're born is the same knowledge after they're born. In Psalm 139, verses 13 through 16, we understand that God has made people fearfully and wonderfully, and God describes them that way even before they're born. God sees the person who eventually grows into an adult in the same way that he views the person in the womb in Genesis 4 and Job chapter 3. And then we see in Luke, in the discussion of Jesus and John the Baptist, the same terminology is used of them when they're still in the womb as when they're out of the womb. So there's a clear prohibition from Exodus 20, verse 13, the sixth commandment, on taking human life. And that would be the same thing for a baby in the womb and a baby out of the womb. Regarding the argument of autonomy, we have to be careful here because while there's a sense in which people should have some ownership, if you will, or stewardship of their own bodies, we remember that the Lord is the one who owns all of the earth and all that it contains. So from a Christian understanding, we recognize that God owns us, and we're merely stewards of our own body. So an argument for personal autonomy may have its place in a limited capacity, but in a civilized society, we never sacrifice the rights of life to another human being merely for the rights of self-expression or the rights of autonomy. Think of it this way. Every time you drive a car and you come to a stop sign, someone has put a limit on your personal autonomy. You can't simply just drive through that stop sign. And the reason why is because we're attempting to save the life of other drivers. So if we do that even with our everyday driving, why would we suggest that we have personal autonomy to kill a baby before it's born simply because someone wants rights to their own body? So in this sense, we would say that from a biblical perspective, the rights of the child would trump the rights of a choice in that sense. Okay, well, let's move to some application then and think about, well, how should a Christian respond? And let me just give two quick words in regard to a public response and a personal response. On the public level, it's really important for us as Christian men to remember that abortion is not merely a woman's issue. It's a human issue. And in a very particular way, it's a man's issue because men are oftentimes the ones who cause the problem. And in addition to that, the children that are being aborted are men and women. And so this is a human issue, and we need to be aware of that and be involved. And some of the ways that we can be involved publicly is voting, peacefully protesting, and even volunteering to work at pro-life clinics that are trying to save the lives of children. You know, recent trends have been showing that a pro-life agenda has been gaining strength in our culture and in the political arena. It's important that we don't grow weary and think that this is our previous generation's battle. Social justice, when rightly understood, it begins in the womb with the protection of life of those who are most vulnerable. So on a personal level, brothers, it's important that we guard the women that are around us and that we protect them by the way we behave sexually and the way that we think about them as human beings. It's also important for us to individually think about how we can be engaged. It's oftentimes the case that if you go to a pro-life or right-to-life clinic where they're trying to help women with unplanned pregnancies, they need men to come and clean the building, they need men to come and do some organization, but what they really need are men that will come in and help counsel the men who are involved in the unplanned pregnancy. Many of those people that are coming in would love to have another man there who could have conversation with them, tell them about Christ, and begin a meaningful relationship. It's also important that for those who may be married, that you discuss with your wife whether or not it might be an opportunity for you to help a young mother or a woman who has an unplanned pregnancy to even come and live in your home and help with some of her financial needs. All of these are ways that we can respond that honor life and honor the babies.